Hey, welcome back to English in Fluency. I'm Alex, and I'm really glad you're here today. Before we start, let me ask you something. Have you ever been listening to someone speak English? Maybe on the phone, maybe in a meeting, maybe just chatting with a friend, and suddenly you feel completely lost. Not because the words were hard, not because the grammar was complicated, but because the person kept going back to something they already said, using different words, and you had no idea they were repeating themselves. You thought it was new information, so you got confused. You missed the real point, and by the time you realized what happened, the conversation had already moved on without you. If that has ever happened to you, don't worry, because today's lesson is going to fix exactly that problem. And honestly, it's one of the most useful listening skills you can build at the B1 level. We're going to talk about how English speakers signal repetition, which basically means, how do they let you know, without saying it directly? Hey, I already told you this, but let me say it again in a different way. And once you learn to hear these signals, listening to real English conversations becomes so much easier, because you stop treating every sentence as brand new information, and you start following the actual shape of what someone is saying. You start catching the key points instead of drowning in details. So stick with me for the next few minutes, because by the end of this lesson, you're going to recognize these patterns instantly, almost like your brain develops a little alarm bell that goes off every time someone repeats a point. Let's get into it. Now, before I give you a list of phrases to memorize, because honestly, lists are boring and you'll forget them in 5 minutes, I want to show you how this actually works in a real, natural conversation. So let me tell you a short story. It's about two people, Daniel and Maya, who work together at a small design studio. Daniel is one of those people who explains things a lot, sometimes too much, and Maya is trying her best to keep up while multitasking, which, let's be honest, we've all been there. Listen carefully to how Daniel repeats his main point several times, but never in the exact same words, and notice how Maya reacts each time she hears one of these repetition signals. It was a Tuesday morning, and Maya was sitting at her desk with 3 browser tabs open, a cold cup of coffee next to her keyboard, and a growing sense of panic about a deadline that was creeping closer by the hour. Daniel walked over, holding his laptop against his chest like it was a shield, and he had that look on his face, the look that meant he had a lot to say. "Hey, so quick thing," he said, which, if you know Daniel, never actually means quick. Maya looked up and gave him a tired smile. "Sure, what's up?" Daniel took a breath and said, "So basically, the client wants us to change the color scheme on the homepage. That's the main thing. I mean, that's really what this whole email is about." Now, pause here for a second, because did you catch that? Daniel just used a repetition signal without even realizing it. He said, "That's the main thing," and then immediately followed it with, "That's really what this whole email is about." He's not adding new information there. He's underlining the same point twice, making sure Maya doesn't miss it. This is exactly what we mean by signaling repetition. Phrases like, "That's the main thing," or "That's really what I'm trying to say," tell your brain, don't worry about new details right now. Just lock onto this one idea, because it matters. Maya nodded slowly, still only half paying attention, and Daniel continued. "They also mentioned the font size, but honestly, like I said, The color scheme is the priority. That's the real issue here. There it is again. Like I said, is one of the clearest, most common repetition signals in spoken English. When you hear, like I said, your brain should immediately think, okay, this is not new. This is the same idea coming back around, probably because the speaker really wants me to remember it. And notice how Daniel didn't repeat his sentence word for word. The first time he said, "That's the main thing," and this time he said, "That's the real issue here." Different words, same core message. This is something a lot of B1 learners struggle with, because in a classroom, repetition often means the exact same sentence said twice. But in real conversation, repetition almost never sounds identical. People rephrase, they use synonyms, they change the sentence structure, but the meaning underneath stays the same. So your job as a listener isn't to catch identical words, it's to catch identical meaning wearing different clothes. Maya finally put her coffee down and turned her chair to face him properly. Okay, wait. So just to be clear, we're focusing on the color first, not the font? And Daniel said, right, exactly. That's what I mean. Color first. The font thing can wait. Now here Maya did something really smart. Something I want you to start doing too when you're practicing your listening skills. She checked her understanding out loud. She basically repeated back what she thought Daniel meant, using her own words, and waited for him to confirm it. This is such a powerful listening strategy because it forces you to actively process what you heard, instead of just letting the words pass through your ears. Even if you're just listening to a podcast or a video and you can't actually respond, you can still do this in your head. Pause for a second and ask yourself, okay, what is this person's actual point? In my own words, if you can answer that clearly, you understood the key point. If you can't, that's a sign you need to listen again, maybe focusing specifically on those repetition signals we just talked about. Daniel kept going, because of course he did. And look, I know I already mentioned this in the meeting yesterday, but I just want to say it one more time. The deadline is Friday, not next Monday. Did you notice that one? I know I already mentioned this, and I just want to say it one more time, are both extremely direct repetition signals. There's no ambiguity here at all. Daniel is literally telling you, this is repeated information. Pay attention because it's important. In real conversations, when someone directly tells you they're repeating something, it almost always means the information is genuinely important to them. Otherwise, why would they bother repeating it at all? So here's a practice tip for you. Whenever you hear phrases like, as I mentioned, like I said before, I want to repeat, or, just to say again, treat that sentence like it has a little spotlight on it. That's the sentence you want to remember, because the speaker themselves is telling you it matters. Maya sighed, not because she was annoyed, but because she was trying to hold all these deadlines in her head at once. Okay, got it. Friday. Color scheme first. Anything else? Daniel shook his head, then paused, then said, actually, yeah, one more thing. And I promise this is related to what I just said. The client also wants the logo slightly bigger. But again, that's secondary to the color change we talked about. See what happened there? He connected new information, the logo size, back to the original repeated point, the color change being the priority. This is another pattern you'll hear constantly in English conversations. Speakers love to organize their thoughts, by connecting new details back to the main repeated point, almost like they're building a small structure where the repeated idea is the foundation and everything else sits on top of it. If you can identify the foundation, the repeated core idea, then all the extra details become much easier to organize in your mind, because you already know where they belong. Let's practice this together for a moment, right here, right now. I want you to imagine you're Maya, sitting at that desk, and you're listening to Daniel. In your head, try to summarize his entire conversation in one sentence, using only the key point, not the details. Take a second. Really think about it. If you said something like, "The main priority is changing the color scheme by Friday," you got it exactly right. Everything else, the font, the logo size, those were secondary details that Daniel mentioned, but then immediately connected back to his main repeated point. This is the skill we're building today, folks, separating the core repeated message from the extra details floating around it. Now, here's something interesting. A few minutes later, Daniel's co-worker, a woman named Priya, walked by and asked what they were talking about. And Daniel, instead of explaining the whole thing again from scratch, said something really natural, something you'll hear all the time in real English. He said, "Oh, same thing as before, just going over the color scheme change again." Notice that phrase, going over again. This is yet another way to signal repetition, and it's incredibly common in workplace English, in casual conversations, even in lectures and presentations. Going over something again doesn't mean there's new information. It means the speaker is reviewing, repeating, making sure everyone is on the same page. When you hear a speaker say, "Let me go over this again," or "just going back over what we discussed," you should relax a little, because you're not about to receive a flood of brand new complicated information. You're about to hear a summary of something already said, just organized a bit differently, maybe a bit clearer this time. Priya, being the naturally curious type, asked a follow-up question. "Wait, is this the same issue from last week's call?" And Daniel replied, "Yeah, basically the same thing, just, coming back to it because the client still hasn't approved it." Basically the same thing is another phrase you should add to your listening radar. When a speaker says basically the same, they're telling you directly that this conversation connects to something earlier, something you might have already heard about. If you're watching an English show, listening to a podcast, or sitting in a meeting, and you hear basically the same thing, don't panic if you feel like you're hearing familiar information, because you probably are, and that's actually a good thing. Because familiar information is easier to understand the second time around. Let's shift the scene for a moment, because I want to show you repetition signals in a slightly different setting. A phone call. Because phone calls are honestly one of the hardest listening situations for English learners. There's no face to read, no body language, no lips to watch, just pure sound. And that can feel intimidating. But guess what? The same repetition signals we just learned apply here too. Maybe even more. Because on the phone, people repeat things constantly to make sure the message actually gets through clearly. So picture this. It's later that same afternoon, and a woman named Nadia is on the phone with her friend Tom, trying to plan a weekend trip. Nadia has already told Tom the plan once, earlier in the week, but now she's calling to confirm the details, because Tom has a habit of forgetting things. Bless his heart. Listen to how Nadia naturally repeats key information throughout the call, and pay close attention to the small words and phrases she uses to signal that repetition. "Hey, Tom, it's me," Nadia said when he picked up. "So, like I mentioned on Monday, we're leaving Saturday morning, not Friday night. Just want to make sure that's still clear." Right away, in her very first sentence, Nadia used "like I mentioned," instantly telling Tom and telling us as listeners that this information isn't new, it's a reminder. Tom responded, a little unsure, "Wait, Saturday morning? I thought it was Friday." And Nadia, patiently, because good friends are patient, said, "Yeah, so, just to repeat what I said before, we changed it to Saturday because Friday traffic is terrible. Remember, I mentioned that when we talked earlier this week?" Notice how she didn't just repeat the fact. She also repeated the reason behind the fact, the traffic issue. Because sometimes when people forget information, they forget the reasoning even more than the actual fact itself. This is such a human thing, right? We remember conclusions more easily than we remember why we reached them. So good communicators, when they repeat something, they often repeat the reasoning too, to help it stick better in your memory. As a listener, this is actually a gift, because when you hear the reason and repeat it alongside the fact, it gives you two chances to catch the same key point, from two different angles. Tom, sounding a little embarrassed, said, "Oh, right. Sorry, yeah. The traffic thing. Now I remember." And Nadia laughed and said, it's fine. That's exactly why I'm calling again, just to go over it one more time before Saturday." There's that phrase again, go over it one more time. At this point, if you're keeping track, you've now heard several different ways to signal repetition just from this one phone call. Like I mentioned, just to repeat what I said. Remember, I mentioned that. And go over it one more time. These phrases might look different on the page, but they're all doing the exact same job. They're all little signposts telling the listener, this is not new, this is a repeat. Pay attention because it obviously matters enough for me to say it again. Nadia continued the call, moving into some new details now. Okay, so besides the timing, here's something new. I actually booked a different hotel than the one I mentioned before. Pay close attention to this sentence, because it's actually really important for your listening skills. Nadia clearly separated the repeated information from the new information. She said, besides the timing, which tells you, we're done talking about the old point now. And then she said, here's something new, which is basically the opposite signal, a signal that fresh information is coming. This is incredibly useful for you as a learner, because native speakers do this constantly. They use small transition phrases to tell you whether you're about to hear something repeated or something brand new. If you train your ear to catch these transition signals, whether it's besides that, on top of that, also, here's something new, moving on, or another thing, you will dramatically improve your ability to follow long conversations without getting lost, because you'll always know whether to relax, because it's familiar information, or focus harder, because something new just arrived. Tom asked, wait, why'd you change the hotel? And Nadia explained, the first one, the one I mentioned before, didn't have parking. So again, just to be clear, we're staying at the new place now, the one near the harbor. Just to be clear is one of my personal favorite repetition signals to teach, because it's so direct and so common. When someone says, "just to be clear," they are basically stopping the conversation for a second and saying, "Look, I really need you to understand this specific point, so let me state it plainly one more time." Whenever you hear "just to be clear" in any English conversation, whether it's a business call, a casual chat, or even a movie, that sentence is basically gift-wrapped for you. It's telling you exactly where to focus your attention. Let's pause the story again for a quick practice moment. I want you to think back to Nadia's phone call and try to identify, just in your head, what were the two main pieces of information she repeated throughout the call. Take a moment. If you said the change in departure time from Friday to Saturday, and the change in hotel because of parking, you got both key points exactly right. Everything else, the reasoning about traffic, the location near the harbor, those were supporting details that connected back to the two main repeated points. See how this works? Once you separate the main repeated points from the supporting details, the entire conversation becomes so much easier to organize in your mind, almost like sorting laundry into different piles instead of having one giant confusing heap. Now let's go back to Daniel and Maya for a moment, because I want to show you one more layer of this skill, something a little more advanced, but still very B1 friendly. I promise. Later that day, Daniel had a short meeting with his manager, a calm, older man named Farid, who had a habit of summarizing things at the end of every conversation. This is actually one of the most useful things you can listen for in any English conversation. The summary at the end, because summaries are basically repetition in its purest form. A speaker taking everything they said and compressing it down into the most important points. Farid listened to Daniel explain the color scheme issue, the deadline, and the logo size request. And then, at the end, he said, "Okay, so let me just make sure I've got this right. Bottom line, we're changing the color scheme. That's priority one. Deadline is Friday, and the logo gets slightly bigger, but that's a smaller detail. Does that sound right?" Now pause here, because this is gold for language learners. Farid used the phrase, "Let me just make sure I've got this right," followed by "bottom line." And then he restated everything in a short, compressed way. Bottom line is an extremely common English phrase that signals, here comes the summary, here comes the core repeated message, stripped of all the extra details. When you hear bottom line, the main point is, so basically, or to sum up, get ready. Because whatever comes right after that phrase is almost certainly the most important piece of information in the entire conversation. If you only caught one sentence in a long meeting or a long video, and it happened to be the sentence right after bottom line, you would still walk away understanding the core message, even if you missed every other detail along the way. Daniel confirmed, "Yeah, that's exactly right." And Farid nodded and said, "Great, just wanted to repeat it back so we're both on the same page." On the same page is a lovely little expression too, very common in workplace English, and it basically means we both understand the same thing. There's no confusion between us. When someone says they want to get on the same page with you, they're often about to repeat information, either their own words or your words, just to confirm mutual understanding. I want you to notice something about this whole story, something that connects everything we've talked about so far. Every single character we followed today, Daniel, Maya, Priya, Nadia, Tom, and Farid, They all repeated information naturally throughout their conversations, but none of them sounded robotic or strange when they did it. That's because repetition in real English isn't awkward. It's actually a completely normal, healthy part of how people communicate. Humans forget things, humans get distracted, humans need reminders, and so speakers naturally build in these repetition signals to help their listeners stay on track. Once you understand that repetition isn't a mistake or a sign of bad English, but actually a helpful tool speakers use on purpose, listening becomes so much less stressful. You stop panicking every time you hear a familiar sentence structure, and you start using it as a helpful anchor point instead. Let's do a slightly longer practice exercise now, and I want you to really engage with this one, because active practice is what actually builds your listening skill, not just passively listening to me talk. Imagine you're on a call with a friend, and they say the following sentence to you, and I want you to listen closely and decide, is this new information, or is this a repetition signal? Here's the sentence. So, just going back to what I said earlier about the party, it's actually starting at 7 now, not 8. Think about it for a second. If you notice the phrase, just going back to what I said earlier, you correctly identified this as a repetition signal, meaning the party was mentioned before, and now the speaker is updating or reconfirming a detail about it, specifically the time. This is such a common pattern in real conversations. Someone mentions something once, then circles back later with an update or a clarification, using a clear repetition signal to help you connect the new sentence to the earlier one. Let's try one more, just to really lock this skill into your brain. Imagine someone says, "Okay, moving on. Next up, we need to talk about the budget." Did you catch that this time? Moving on and next up are actually the opposite signal. They tell you that the previous topic is finished, and something completely new is starting. This is just as important to recognize as repetition signals, because knowing when a topic has ended is just as useful as knowing when it's being repeated. Together, these two types of signals, repetition signals and transition signals, work like signposts along a road, telling you exactly where you are in a conversation, whether you're circling back to familiar territory or heading into something brand new. I want to give you one more practice scenario before we wrap up, because I really want this skill to stick with you, not just for today, but for every English conversation you have from now on. Picture a short lecture, maybe in a classroom or a video, where a teacher named Elena is explaining a topic to her students. Elena says, "Now, remember what we talked about last class. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level." I'm mentioning this again because it's going to be really important for today's experiment. Listen to how naturally Elena connects old, repeated information, the boiling point of water, to new information, today's experiment. This happens constantly in educational settings, in tutorials, in explainer videos, because teachers and speakers know that repeating foundational information helps build a bridge to new, more complex information. Whenever you're watching an educational video in English and you hear a phrase like, "Remember what we talked about," or "as we discussed before," treat that moment as a checkpoint. It's the speaker confirming, "Before we move forward, let's make sure this foundation is solid." And that foundation is usually going to connect directly to whatever comes next. So let's bring everything together now, and I want you to think about how you can actually apply this in your daily listening practice, starting today, not next week, not someday, today. The next time you listen to an English podcast, watch a YouTube video, or even have a real conversation with someone, I want you to actively listen for these specific signals. Listen for phrases like I said, as I mentioned, just to repeat, going over this again, bottom line, to sum up, just to be clear, and going back to what I said. Every single time you catch one of these phrases, pause for half a second in your mind and think, okay, this is important. This is the speaker highlighting a key point for me. And on the flip side, listen for the transition signals too. Phrases like moving on, next up, here's something new, and besides that, because these tell you when a fresh topic is starting, which is just as valuable to know. Here's something I really want you to remember. Something almost a little emotional, if I'm honest. Learning to hear these small signals isn't just about grammar or vocabulary. It's about confidence. Think about how it feels when you're in a conversation and you suddenly realize, wait, I actually understood that. I followed the whole thing. I didn't get lost. That feeling, that little spark of confidence, that's what building this skill gives you. Every single repetition signal you learn to recognize is one less moment of confusion in your daily life. One less time you feel embarrassed asking someone to repeat themselves. One less time you nod along pretending to understand when really you're completely lost. I know that feeling. So many learners know that feeling, and it's honestly one of the most frustrating parts of learning a new language. But the good news is, this specific skill, hearing repetition signals, is something you can genuinely master with practice. Because unlike some parts of English that feel unpredictable, these phrases are actually pretty consistent and pretty predictable once you know what to listen for. Let's go back to our characters one final time, just to bring the story to a natural close. It was almost the end of the day, and Maya was finishing up her work when Daniel walked by again, laptop still held against his chest like always. "Hey," he said, "just wanted to quickly recap everything before you head out." Maya smiled, because at this point she knew exactly what was coming. "Let me guess," she said. "Color scheme, Friday deadline, logo slightly bigger." Daniel laughed. "Yeah, exactly. You got it." And that right there, that little moment, is honestly the perfect example of what happens when someone truly masters listening for repetition signals. Maya didn't need Daniel to explain everything all over again, because she had been actively listening the entire day, catching each repeated point, connecting the details to the main ideas. And now she could summarize the whole thing herself, faster and more clearly than Daniel even could. That's the goal here. That's what we're working toward. Not just understanding what someone says in the moment, but being able to hold on to it, organize it, and repeat it back confidently in your own words whenever you need to. Before we finish up today, let's do one final combined practice round, bringing together everything we've covered, repetition signals and key point tracking, all in one go. I'm going to describe a short scenario, and I want you to actively listen, really picture it happening, and try to identify both the repeated key point and the new information. Here it is. A man named Omar is talking to his sister on a video call. He says, "So, like I told you last week, Mom's birthday dinner is definitely happening on Sunday. That hasn't changed. But here's something new. Dad wants to bring a cake from that bakery downtown, the one we went to last year. Take a moment and think about this. What's the repeated key point? If you said the Sunday birthday dinner, you're exactly right, and you probably caught it because of the clear signal, like I told you last week, combined with the confirming phrase that hasn't changed. And what's the new information? If you said the cake from the bakery, you nailed it too, especially because of that clear transition phrase, here's something new. See how naturally this all fits together once you know what to listen for? You're not guessing anymore. You're actually hearing the structure of the conversation, almost like reading a map instead of wandering around lost. Let's stretch this skill a little further now, because I want to show you how repetition signals work when there's more than just two people talking, because group conversations, meetings, and even family dinners can feel a lot more overwhelming when multiple voices are jumping in, adding their own thoughts, and sometimes repeating each other's points in slightly different ways. This actually happens all the time in real English, and honestly, it can feel like a wall of noise if you don't know what to listen for. So let's slow it down together. Picture a small team meeting at that same design studio a few days later. Around the table are Daniel, Maya, Priya, and their manager Farid, along with a new person joining the story now, a quieter, thoughtful woman named Ingrid, who works on the technical side of things. Farid starts the meeting by saying, "Okay, everyone. Quick recap before we jump into new stuff. As we discussed last week, and I know I've said this a few times now, the client approved the new color scheme, so that part is officially locked in." Notice that Farid actually stacked two repetition signals together in one sentence, as we discussed last week, and I know I've said this a few times now. When speakers stack multiple repetition signals close together like this, it's almost like they're adding extra emphasis, practically shouting, without raising their voice at all. This point really matters. Please don't forget it. Whenever you notice 2 or 3 repetition phrases clustered together in a short space, treat that moment as extremely high-priority information, because the speaker is going out of their way to make absolutely sure it lands. Maya chimed in immediately after Farid finished, adding her own repetition on top of his. Right, and just to echo what Farid said, the color thing is done. We're good there. No need to revisit it. Did you catch her phrase, just to echo what Farid said? This is a fantastic one to add to your listening list, because it's specifically used when one speaker wants to agree with and reinforce something a previous speaker already said. Echoing someone in conversation means repeating their idea in your own words, usually to show agreement or to add extra weight to the point. In group settings, English speakers echo each other constantly. And honestly, once you start noticing it, you'll hear it everywhere. In meetings, in panel discussions, even in casual group chats among friends. When multiple people echo the same point one after another, that's basically a huge flashing sign, telling you this is the most important thing happening in this entire conversation right now. Priya, who hadn't said much yet, added her own version too. Yeah, agreed. Like, that decision's final. Moving forward, we're not changing it again. Notice how she used slightly different words again. That decision's final. But the underlying meaning connects perfectly to what Farid and Maya already said. This is such a valuable thing to notice, Because in a group conversation, you might hear the same core idea expressed 3 or 4 different ways by 3 or 4 different people. And if you're only listening for exact repeated words, you'll completely miss the pattern. But if you're listening for repeated meaning, the way we've been practicing this whole lesson, you'll catch it immediately. And honestly, it becomes almost satisfying, like solving a little puzzle every single time. Then Ingrid spoke up for the first time, and her contribution added something genuinely new to the conversation, which gave us a nice contrast to notice. So, moving on from the color topic, I wanted to bring up something different. The loading speed on the homepage has actually gotten slower this week. Hear that clear shift? Moving on from the color topic tells you, clearly and directly, that the repeated section of the conversation has ended and something brand new is starting. This is such a helpful moment to practice recognizing, because good listeners aren't just people who catch every repeated point. They're also people who know exactly when a conversation has shifted into new territory, so they can refocus their attention and start absorbing fresh information instead of continuing to process something already understood. Let's pause again for a quick practice round, because I want you to actually try this out. Not just listen passively. Imagine you're sitting in this exact meeting, and afterward, someone asks you, "Hey, what was the main outcome of that meeting?" Take a second and think about how you'd answer using everything we just heard. If you said something like, "The color scheme decision is final, and now there's a new issue with the homepage loading speed," you did a fantastic job separating the heavily repeated point, the color decision, from the brand new point, the loading speed issue. This is exactly the skill employers, teachers, and honestly just people in everyday life value so much, being able to walk away from a long, sometimes messy conversation and summarize it clearly and accurately in just 1 or 2 sentences. Now, let's look at one more type of scenario, because I think it's incredibly useful for real life, and that's customer service calls. Because if you've ever called a company about a problem, whether it's your internet, a delivery, or a billing issue, you know these calls are absolutely packed with repetition signals, mostly because the person on the other end wants to be 100% sure there's no misunderstanding, especially when money or important dates are involved. So imagine a woman named Renata calling her internet provider because her bill seems higher than usual. The customer service representative, a calm and professional man named Julian, picks up the call. After Renata explains the issue, Julian says, "Okay, so just to make sure I understand you correctly, you're saying the bill increased by $20 this month compared to last month. Is that right?" This phrase, "just to make sure I understand you correctly," is actually a repetition signal used from the listener's side, not the speaker's side, and it's incredibly useful to recognize too. When someone repeats back what you said, using phrases like this, they're checking their understanding. And honestly, this is a fantastic phrase for you to start using yourself in your own English conversations, because it instantly makes you sound more confident and more careful as a communicator, even at a B1 level. Renata confirms, "Yes, exactly. $20 more." Julian continues, "All right, so, like I mentioned when you first called, sometimes this happens because of a temporary promotional discount ending. Let me check your account and see if that's what happened here." A minute later, he comes back and says, "Okay, so, to repeat what I found, your account did have a 12-month promotional discount, and that discount ended last month, which explains the $20 increase." Notice how Julian structured his explanation, first hinting at the possible reason using a repetition signal, like I mentioned, and then confirming it clearly using another repetition signal, to repeat what I found. This layered approach, hint first, confirmation second, is extremely common in problem-solving conversations, whether it's customer service, medical appointments, or even car repair explanations. Recognizing this pattern helps you follow along even in stressful, detail-heavy conversations, because you know the speaker is going to circle back and confirm the key point clearly before the conversation ends. Renata, wanting to be extra sure, asks, "Wait, so just to be totally clear, this isn't a mistake on your end? It's just the discount ending?" And Julian responds, "Correct, exactly right. Just to confirm one more time, it's not a billing error. It's simply the promotional period ending as scheduled." By the end of this short call, the key point, the discount ending and explaining the price increase, has actually been repeated in some form nearly 4 separate times, using 4 slightly different phrasings. And that's honestly very normal for calls like this, because when money or important details are involved, both speakers naturally want extra confirmation, extra repetition, extra certainty before ending the conversation. Here's a fun little practice challenge for you, and I want you to really try this one, maybe even pause the video for a second if you need to. Think back through Renata and Julian's entire phone call and try to count, just roughly, how many times the core idea, the promotional discount ending, was repeated using different words. If you counted somewhere around 3 or 4 times, you're absolutely right. And more importantly, you're now actively noticing something that used to happen invisibly in the background of every conversation you've ever listened to. That invisible pattern, my friends, is now visible to you. And honestly, that's exactly the kind of shift that takes your English listening skills from good to genuinely confident. There's one more setting I really want to walk through with you because it's a situation almost every English learner ends up in sooner or later, and it can feel genuinely stressful if you're not used to the vocabulary, and that's a doctor's appointment. Medical conversations are actually a goldmine for repetition signals, because doctors know that patients are often nervous, sometimes distracted by worry, and might not absorb information the first time it's said, so doctors repeat important instructions constantly, almost as a habit, almost as a kindness. Picture a young man named Bruno sitting in an exam room talking to his doctor, a friendly, patient woman named Dr. Alvarez. Bruno has been having headaches, and Dr. Alvarez has just finished examining him. She says, "Okay, Bruno, so here's what I think is going on, and I'm going to explain it now, and then I'll go over it again at the end just so it's clear, because I know medical stuff can be a lot to take in at once." Right there, before she even starts explaining anything, Dr. Alvarez tells Bruno directly that repetition is coming later. This is actually a really thoughtful communication habit, and you'll notice it from good communicators in all kinds of professional settings, teachers, doctors, managers. They'll often warn you in advance, saying something like, "I'll repeat this later," or "Don't worry if you don't catch everything now. I'll summarize at the end. When you hear this kind of warning at the beginning of a conversation, it's actually incredibly reassuring, because it tells you, relax a little. You don't need to catch every single word perfectly right now, because a clear, repeated summary is coming. Dr. Alvarez continues, "So, it looks like these headaches are probably caused by tension, likely from stress or maybe from sitting at a computer for long hours without breaks. I want you to try taking short breaks every hour, drinking more water throughout the day, and if the headaches continue for more than 2 weeks, come back and we'll look into it further." Bruno nods, clearly trying to remember everything, and Dr. Alvarez, true to her word, says, "Okay, so let's just go over that one more time before you head out. Breaks every hour, more water, and if it's still happening after 2 weeks, come back in. Sound good?" Notice how her final repetition was much shorter and much simpler than her first explanation. This is actually a brilliant pattern worth noticing. Speakers often give a longer, more detailed explanation the first time, and then a short, compressed repetition at the end, almost like a highlight reel of just the essential points. If you ever find a longer explanation confusing or overwhelming, don't panic. Just hold on, because a shorter, clearer, repeated version is very likely coming soon after, especially in situations like this one, where clarity really matters. Bruno, feeling a little more confident now, repeats it back himself. "Okay, so breaks every hour, drink more water, come back if it's still happening in 2 weeks." And Dr. Alvarez smiles and says, "Exactly. You got it. See that? Bruno did exactly what Maya did earlier in our story, and exactly what I encouraged you to practice doing yourself. He actively repeated the key points back, in his own simplified words, which not only helped him remember the information better, but also let the doctor confirm that he actually understood everything correctly. This strategy works in literally every single conversation type we've covered today: workplace meetings, phone calls, customer service calls, and now medical appointments too. Repeating key information back, even briefly, even just a few words, is one of the most powerful listening and confirming tools available to you as an English learner, and, honestly, as a communicator in any language. Let's take a moment now to gently gather up all the different repetition signal phrases we've heard scattered throughout today's story. Not as a boring list to memorize, but just as a friendly little review, spoken naturally, the way you'd actually hear them in real life. Throughout today, our characters used phrases like I said, as I mentioned, just to repeat, going over this again, bottom line, to sum up, just to be clear, going back to what I said, just to echo what someone said, just to make sure I understand you correctly, to repeat what I found, and let's go over that one more time. That's honestly a huge collection of natural, real phrases, and the beautiful thing is, you didn't memorize them from a boring list. You heard them living inside real conversations, attached to real emotions, real situations, real people like Daniel, Maya, Nadia, Tom, Farid, Priya, Ingrid, Renata, Julian, and Bruno. That's exactly how your brain learns language best, through context, through story, through emotion, not through flashcards alone. Let's do one final, slightly bigger challenge before we wrap up completely. And I want you to really commit to trying this, even just in your head. I'm going to give you a short passage, a little bit longer than our earlier practice examples, combining several signals together. And I want you to listen carefully and try to identify every single repetition signal you hear, plus the one main key point being repeated throughout. Here it comes. Imagine a woman named Sophia talking to her roommate about their apartment's rent increase. She says, "Okay, so like I mentioned last week, our rent is going up by $50 starting next month. That's still happening. Nothing's changed there. I know I've brought this up a few times now, but I really want to make sure we're on the same page before we talk to the landlord. So, bottom line, we need an extra $50 each month starting in September. And just to be clear, that's not negotiable based on what he told me." Take a moment now. Really think it through. How many repetition signals did you catch? If you noticed, like I mentioned, that's still happening? Nothing's changed there. I know I've brought this up a few times now. On the same page, bottom line. And, just to be clear, you caught 6 separate repetition signals in one single short passage, all pointing toward the exact same core message, the $50 rent increase starting in September. That's actually a fantastic real-world example of how densely packed repetition signals can be in a single conversation, especially when someone really wants to make sure their point lands clearly. Let's look at one final scenario, and this one's a bit different from the others, because it involves listening to an announcement rather than a two-person conversation, and honestly, this situation trips up so many English learners, especially at airports, train stations, and other places where important information gets repeated over speakers, often with background noise, echo, and a bit of static making everything harder to catch the first time. Picture a busy airport terminal and a traveler named Yusuf sitting near his gate, headphones half in his ears, a little distracted, scrolling through his phone. Over the speaker system, a calm voice announces, "Attention passengers, this is a reminder. As previously announced, Flight 227 to Lisbon is now boarding at Gate 14. I repeat, Flight 227 to Lisbon, boarding now at Gate 14. Notice something interesting here. The announcer literally says, "I repeat," right in the middle of the announcement, and then says the exact same information again, almost word for word this time, rather than rephrasing it. This is actually a really important pattern to recognize too, because unlike conversational repetition, which usually uses different words each time, formal announcements, safety instructions, and official information often repeat using the exact same wording, precisely because clarity and accuracy matter more than variety in these situations. So, when you're listening to announcements, whether at an airport, on a train, or during a fire drill, and you hear, "I repeat," get ready for the exact same words to come right after, which actually makes these particular announcements a little easier to catch, because you get a second identical chance to understand it if you missed it the first time. Yusuf, hearing this, quickly gathers his bag and heads toward Gate 14, but as he's walking, another announcement comes on. Just a reminder to all passengers, as we mentioned earlier, the flight to Lisbon has a slight gate change. That's now Gate 14, not Gate 12 as originally listed. Here we go again, as we mentioned earlier, combined with as originally listed, both phrases clearly signaling that this gate change was already announced before. And this is simply a repeated reminder to make sure nobody misses it, especially anyone who might have been distracted, like Yusuf with his headphones half in. This scenario really highlights something important about why these repetition skills matter so much in real life. Beyond just passing an English test or sounding fluent in a classroom. In real situations, missing repeated key information can actually cause real problems. Missing a flight, showing up at the wrong gate, misunderstanding a medical instruction, or misunderstanding a bill from your internet provider. So this isn't just an academic listening exercise, it's a genuinely practical life skill. And that's honestly part of why I wanted to build today's entire lesson around real, relatable stories instead of just abstract grammar rules. Because language learning sticks so much better when it's connected to situations you can actually picture yourself in, situations with real stakes, real emotions, and real people just like Yusuf, rushing through an airport, trying to catch every important word through the noise and distraction around him. Let's do one very last practice round together, combining everything from this whole lesson into one final challenge. I want you to imagine you're listening to a mixed conversation, part workplace update, part personal update, and I want you to catch both the repetition signals and the actual key point being repeated. Here it is. A woman named Camilla says to her coworker, "So, quick recap before the call starts. Like I said in the group chat, the presentation is now Thursday, not Wednesday. That hasn't changed. Also, just a heads up, something new? They added an extra 10 minutes for questions at the end." Pause and think this through one final time. The repetition signals here are, like I said in the group chat, and that hasn't changed, both pointing toward the repeated key point, the presentation date being Thursday. Then the transition signal, also, just a heads up, something new, clearly introduces fresh information, the extra 10 minutes for questions. If you caught all of that clearly, genuinely, take a moment to appreciate how far you've come in just this one lesson. Because at the beginning of today's video, sentences like this might have felt like a confusing wall of words. And now, you're breaking them apart naturally, almost automatically, separating repeated key points from new details with real confidence. I want to leave you with one more thought before we wrap up, something practical you can actually do this week. Pick any English video, podcast, or show you enjoy watching, something you already like, because honestly, practicing with content you enjoy always works better than forcing yourself through something boring. As you watch or listen, keep a small notebook nearby, or even just the Notes app on your phone, and every single time you hear a repetition signal, phrases like the ones we covered today, jot down just a couple of words, enough to remind yourself later. At the end of the video, look back at your notes and try to reconstruct the main points of what you watched, using only those repeated signals as your guide. I promise you, if you do this consistently, even just a few times a week, you'll notice a real difference in how confidently you follow English conversations, especially longer ones, the kind that used to make you feel tired and lost after just a few minutes. And listen, I know practicing a new skill like this can feel a little slow at first, maybe even a little frustrating, especially if you're used to catching individual words, but struggling to hold on to the bigger picture of a conversation. But trust me on this one, the moment this skill clicks for you, and it will click, probably sooner than you expect, it genuinely changes how English conversations feel. They stop feeling like a wall of confusing sound, and they start feeling like a story you can actually follow, with a clear beginning, clear key points, and a clear ending, just like the story we walked through together today, with Daniel, Maya, Nadia, Tom, Fareed, Priya, Ingrid, Renata, Julian, Bruno, Yusuf, Camila, and Omar. Here's something else worth mentioning, because I think it'll genuinely help you feel less pressure around this whole process. You don't need to catch 100% of every conversation to be a good listener. Honestly, even native speakers miss words here and there, mishear things, or need something repeated occasionally. That's just part of being human, part of having a conversation in real time without a pause button. What actually separates a confident listener from a frustrated one isn't perfect word-for-word understanding, it's the ability to hold on to the main thread of a conversation, even when a few individual words slip past unnoticed. And that's exactly what today's skill gives you, a way to hold on to that thread, using the speaker's own repeated signals as your guide rope, pulling you gently back to the main point whenever you start to feel a little lost in the details. I also want to mention something a little personal here, if that's all right. When I first started paying close attention to how repetition actually works in spoken English, years ago, it honestly changed how I experienced conversations, in a way I didn't expect. Before that, I used to feel this quiet exhaustion after long conversations or long meetings, like my brain had been working overtime just trying to catch every single word. But once I started noticing these repeated signals, once I understood that speakers are constantly, almost generously, giving me a second and sometimes a third chance to catch their main point, conversations started to feel lighter somehow, less like a test I might fail, and more like a story unfolding naturally, one I could actually relax into and enjoy. I really hope this lesson gives you a little bit of that same relief, that same lightness, because you absolutely deserve to enjoy English conversations instead of just surviving them. One more small but genuinely useful tip before we move into today's practice challenge. When you're watching English videos or listening to podcasts specifically to practice this skill, try choosing content that includes some kind of explanation, tutorial, interview, or storytelling, rather than fast-paced entertainment with lots of quick cuts and background music, at least at the beginning of your practice. Explanatory content, the kind where someone is teaching, guiding, or walking you through something step by step, naturally includes far more repetition signals, because the speaker genuinely wants to make sure you understand and remember what they're saying. Once you've built up your confidence recognizing these signals in slower, clearer content, you can absolutely move on to faster, more casual conversations, interviews, or even movies. And you'll be amazed at how much more of the underlying structure you're able to catch, even when the speech itself is quick or informal. So here's what I want you to do right now, before you close this video or move on to whatever's next in your day. First, if this lesson helped you even a little bit, hit that like button. Seriously, it helps this channel grow, and it helps more English learners just like you find these lessons. Second, if you haven't already, subscribe to English in Fluency, because we release new listening practice lessons regularly, and each one builds on skills just like the ones we covered today. So you'll keep growing week after week without even realizing how far you've come. Third, and this one's really important, leave a comment below and tell me one repetition signal phrase you're going to actively listen for this week. Just one. Something like I said, or just to be clear. Writing it down and saying it publicly actually helps you remember to use it. Trust me on that. And finally, if you know someone else who's learning English, maybe a friend, a classmate, a coworker, share this video with them, because honestly, learning together, discussing these signals together, catching them in real conversations together, that makes the whole process so much more enjoyable and so much more effective. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I really appreciate you being here, practicing, listening carefully, and pushing your English forward one small step at a time. Remember, every single conversation you have from now on is a chance to practice exactly what we covered today. So stay curious, stay patient with yourself, and keep listening actively, because you are absolutely capable of understanding English conversations clearly and confidently. I'm Alex. This has been English in Fluency, and I'll see you in the next lesson, where we're going to build on today's skill even further. Take care, keep practicing, and I'll talk to you very soon.